It began as a hushed conversation deep within the private corridors of Kensington Palace, one that aides tried to dismiss and courtiers rushed to silence. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she stepped out told a different story. Something irreversible had just been triggered. And it wasn't just about legacy, it was about a clause no one was supposed to enforce. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Behind those sealed doors, William, Prince of Wales, had not simply convened another routine consultation. This was an emergency assembly, one that pulled in senior legal advisors bound not only by duty, but by silence so absolute it bordered on fear. What they placed before him was not new, yet it had remained buried, untouched, deliberately ignored. Tied intricately to the enduring legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, a clause quietly embedded within layers of royal documentation, one that had long been dismissed as ceremonial, symbolic, even obsolete. But in that moment, it was neither symbolic nor dormant. It was active, and the realization of that single truth sent a ripple through the room that no one could fully contain. Catherine's reaction was not one of confusion, but of recognition and understanding that something far deeper than protocol had just surfaced. Her composure faltered, not publicly, not dramatically, but in a way that those closest to her could not ignore. Aides began exchanging glances, whispers slipping through tightly controlled corridors, one word repeated in low, urgent tones: activation. No one dared to define it openly, yet everyone understood its weight. Because if this clause was indeed enforceable, it meant decisions made long ago, decisions tied to Diana's influence and intentions, were now demanding acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement came with consequences real, immediate, and impossible to contain within the palace walls. William, known for his measured control, was forced into a position where hesitation was no longer an option. The legal advisors did not offer comfort, only clarity. The clause, once triggered, could not simply be reversed or quietly set aside. It required action. It demanded response. And in that moment, the future trajectory of the monarchy itself began to shift, not with public declarations, but with quiet, deliberate movements behind closed doors. Catherine's silence as she left that room was perhaps the loudest signal of all, because it was not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of someone who understood that a line had been crossed, one that could never be redrawn. The palace, often seen as a fortress of stability, suddenly felt fragile, as though its foundations were being tested by something long buried and now impossible to ignore. And as whispers continued to spread, carefully contained but undeniably present, one truth became impossible to escape. Whatever had been uncovered was no longer a secret, it was a force. But what had been uncovered wasn't just a forgotten clause, it was a legal trigger powerful enough to shake the very foundation of the monarchy itself. It was never meant to be found, not like this. Buried within layers of legal language and protected under royal confidentiality, Princess Diana's clause was designed as a safeguard, not a weapon. Yet now, in early 2026, it had resurfaced at the exact moment the monarchy was most vulnerable, and its implications were devastating. What emerged from those sealed archives was not merely a forgotten technicality, but a deliberate measure crafted during a time when Diana, Princess of Wales, understood more than she ever revealed publicly. This clause, embedded quietly within a network of legal protections tied to her legacy, was never intended to disrupt the present. It was designed to protect the future, specifically the integrity of the bloodline she left behind. And yet, the very nature of its design made it impossible to ignore once rediscovered. It was not symbolic, it was enforceable. And that single realization sent a shockwave through those entrusted with safeguarding the monarchy's stability. Legal advisors, brought in under the strictest confidentiality, did not debate its existence, they confirmed its validity. Under the current royal legal framework, the clause still held power, its language precise, its authority intact, and its conditions alarmingly relevant to the present circumstances unfolding behind palace walls. This was not an outdated relic. It was a living mechanism waiting for the exact convergence of events that had now, undeniably, arrived. The timing was not just unfortunate, it was explosive. Because while the monarchy outwardly projected continuity and control, internally it was already navigating a fragile balance of influence, authority, and unspoken tensions that had been building for years. The reappearance of this clause did not create those tensions, it exposed them. Quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, concern began to ripple through senior palace officials. Conversations grew shorter, more guarded. Decisions that once seemed routine were suddenly delayed, reconsidered, weighed against implications no one had anticipated needing to confront. There was no public acknowledgement, no formal statement, but within those inner circles, the atmosphere shifted from cautious control to something far more unstable, quiet panic. Because the clause did not merely outline a principle, it imposed a condition, one that could challenge decisions already made, relationships already solidified, and positions already secured. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the understanding that this was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of execution. Once acknowledged, it demanded action. Once understood, it could not be undone. Those closest to the unfolding situation began to realize that this was not about honoring Diana's memory in the abstract. It was about confronting a directive she had left behind, one that carried consequences for the present leadership of the monarchy. And as that realization deepened, one question began to surface, quietly but persistently. Across every private discussion and every carefully controlled exchange, who exactly would be forced to answer for it? Because the clause did not exist in isolation. It pointed with unsettling precision toward a figure at the very center of the current royal structure. And as the weight of the clause became undeniable, attention shifted to the one person it would impact the most, Queen Camilla. For years, Queen Camilla had solidified her place within the royal structure carefully, strategically, and with unwavering persistence. But what she didn't anticipate was a legal mechanism from the past resurfacing to challenge everything she had built. And now, that challenge was no longer theoretical, it was active. Queen Camilla had spent decades navigating a path that was never guaranteed, transforming skepticism into acceptance, resistance into quiet acknowledgement, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, stepping into a position of undeniable influence beside Charles III. Her presence was no longer questioned in public, her role no longer framed as temporary or symbolic. Instead, it had evolved into something far more embedded within the monarchy's operational core, where her voice began to carry weight in decisions that extended beyond ceremonial duties. Advisors listened, schedules adjusted, and with each passing year, her authority became less about perception and more about reality. But power, once established, does not exist in isolation. It invites scrutiny, resistance, and in this case, consequences that had been waiting far longer than anyone anticipated. Because as reports quietly circulated within palace corridors, there was growing recognition that her influence had extended further than originally intended, shaping not only public-facing roles, but internal decisions that affected the monarchy's future direction. It was subtle, controlled, yet unmistakable to those watching closely. And then, almost without warning, the balance shifted. The clause long buried, long ignored did not arrive as a suggestion. It arrived as a disruption. A recalibration of authority that forced even the most loyal advisors to pause and reassess what had once seemed settled. Conversations that had previously reinforced her standing began to change tone, becoming cautious, measured, even uncertain. Legal teams revisited frameworks that had not been questioned in years, examining implications that no longer felt hypothetical. And in that process, something far more unsettling began to emerge: the possibility that her position, while publicly secure, was now privately under review. Not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through quiet evaluation that carried far greater weight than any public scrutiny ever could. Within those inner circles, shifts became noticeable. Invitations grew selective. Consultations became limited. The ease that once defined her interactions within the palace began to erode, replaced by a careful distance that spoke volumes without a single word being said. It was not exclusion in the traditional sense, but something far more controlled and isolation that unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And through it all, one truth remained impossible to ignore. This was not a reaction driven by emotion, but by obligation. The clause did not negotiate, it dictated. and those bound to uphold it could not simply look away. For Camilla, the shift was not immediate collapse, but a slow, tightening realization that the structure supporting her position was no longer as immovable as it once seemed. Every decision now carried a question, every interaction, a hidden calculation. The authority she had built so carefully was no longer being measured by loyalty or acceptance, it was being measured against something far older, far more rigid, and far less forgiving. And as that reality settled into the very fabric of palace operations, it became clear that this was not just a moment of tension, it was the beginning of something far more decisive. But this wasn't just about position, it was about power, and someone had already decided it was time to act. There was no announcement, no warning, just action. William, Prince of Wales, had reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. With the clause confirmed and the legal framework aligned, he moved forward with a decision that would alter the monarchy's internal balance overnight. What had once been a matter of quiet consultation now became something far more deliberate, far more controlled. In the days following the clause's confirmation, William did not act impulsively, he moved with precision, drawing in only those he trusted without question, figures whose loyalty extended beyond titles and into something far more binding. These were not casual conversations, they were strategic alignments, carefully constructed discussions that weighed not only the immediate impact, but the long-term consequences of enforcement. Because this was never about a single moment, it was about reshaping a structure that had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, in its current form. The clause tied to Diana, Princess of Wales, was no longer a dormant safeguard, it was an active directive, and William understood that once set into motion, there would be no reversing its course. Every step forward had to be calculated. Every move had to be final. And so, the process began not with public declarations, but with silent shifts that carried far more weight than any announcement ever could. Internal channels were adjusted. Lines of authority were subtly redrawn. Decisions that once flowed in, predictable patterns began to change direction almost overnight, and those within the palace, those attuned to its rhythms, felt it immediately. Something was happening, something irreversible. Behind the scenes, an alliance began to take shape, not one defined by visibility, but by intent. Senior figures, long accustomed to maintaining stability, found themselves aligned with a decision that prioritized obligation over comfort, legacy over convenience. It was not a rebellion. It was not a power grab. It was something far more complex, a coordinated enforcement of a condition that had been waiting silently for this exact moment. And William, fully aware of the weight he carried, did not waver. There were no leaks, no premature signals, no room for interference. The execution was clean, controlled, and deliberate, unfolding in a way that left no space for uncertainty once it began. And as the first phase of that enforcement took hold, the effects rippled outward with startling speed. Palace operations, once seamless, began to shift under the pressure of new directives. Roles were reassessed, influence recalibrated. Conversations that had once been routine took on a new gravity, as if every word now carried consequences that extended far beyond the present moment. Even those removed from the immediate decision could sense it, the quiet transformation of a system that had, until now, operated on carefully maintained balance. Because this was not just about activating a clause. It was about redefining what that clause meant in practice and who it would ultimately impact. And as the full scope of William's decision began to unfold, one truth became impossible to ignore. The monarchy was no longer operating under the same assumptions it once had. The rules had changed, the boundaries had shifted, and those who had once felt secure within them were now forced to confront a reality they could no longer control. But enforcing the clause was only the beginning, because the consequences would reach far beyond a single decision. At the center of it all stood Charles III, a monarch already under immense personal and institutional pressure. What unfolded next wasn't just a legal confrontation, it was a deeply personal reckoning. And for Charles, the cost of this moment would be impossible to ignore. By the time he was formally informed of the decision set into motion by William, Prince of Wales, the machinery was already turning, its momentum too precise, too calculated to be paused without consequence. This was not a proposal brought forward for discussion. It was an action already in effect, shaped by the authority of a clause tied to Diana, Princess of Wales, now operating within the very framework Charles himself was sworn to uphold. And that was the contradiction he could not escape, because in that moment, he was not simply a father confronted with his son's decisive move, nor merely a husband facing the implications for Queen Camilla. He was the sovereign bound by a system that left him with far less control than the title implied. The weight of that realization settled quickly, pressing against both his personal loyalties and his institutional responsibilities, forcing him into a position where neither could be fully honored without compromising the other. Those closest to him began to notice the strain, not through overt reactions, but through subtle shifts that revealed far more than any public statement ever could. Conversations shortened, decisions slowed, moments that once carried confidence now seemed measured, cautious, as though each step forward required recalibration against a reality he had not anticipated facing. The clause did not offer him room to maneuver. It did not invite negotiation. Its authority existed independently of preference, of sentiment, even of hierarchy. And that, perhaps more than anything, defined the gravity of the situation. Because while Charles remained the monarch in title, enforcement of the clause introduced a limitation that was both legal and symbolic, a reminder that the monarchy's structure was not solely shaped by present leadership, but by commitments made in the past, commitments that could resurface without warning and demand compliance. The perception of control, carefully maintained over years of transition and adaptation, began to fracture under that pressure. Within palace circles, the shift was impossible to ignore. There was no open defiance, no visible confrontation, yet the dynamic had changed. Authority no longer flowed in a single direction. It was being redirected, recalibrated, influenced by a force that Charles could acknowledge but not easily contain. And in that space between acknowledgement and action, a quiet tension began to grow, one that extended beyond personal relationships and into the very core of how the monarchy functioned. For Charles, the challenge was not simply to respond, but to reconcile, to find a way to navigate a moment where his role as king demanded acceptance, while his role as a man demanded resistance. And yet, every indication suggested that resistance was no longer a viable option. The clause had been activated, the process had begun, and the consequences were already unfolding in ways that could not be undone. As that reality settled, one truth became increasingly clear, not just to Charles, but to those observing the shift from within the monarchy was no longer balancing on tradition alone. It was being reshaped by forces that operated beneath the surface, forces that did not seek permission, only compliance. And as the full weight of that transformation pressed against the institution's highest level, it became evident that this was not a passing moment of internal strain, but something far more permanent, far more defining. And as the reality set in, it became clear that this wasn't just a moment of tension, it was a turning point. No official statements, no public acknowledgement, yet inside palace walls, everything had changed. The silence wasn't calm, it was controlled. And behind that silence, a complete restructuring was quietly unfolding. What had once been a system defined by predictability was now shifting in ways that only those closest to it could fully understand. Access points that had remained consistent for years were suddenly restricted. Roles that had once seemed permanent were reassigned without explanation, and familiar patterns of communication were replaced with something far more deliberate. Those within the inner circle were not given detailed explanations, they were given instructions. Maintain discretion. Limit discussion. Follow the new structure without question. It was not chaos, it was precision. A recalibration executed so carefully that it left no visible disruption, yet altered everything beneath the surface. And at the center of it all was a growing awareness that the clause's activation had triggered more than a legal adjustment. It had initiated a quiet reordering of influence itself. Aides, long accustomed to the rhythms of palace operations, found themselves navigating an environment where certainty had been replaced with calculation. Every interaction carried weight. Every movement felt observed. The boundaries of authority were no longer assumed, they were being redefined in real time. And yet, despite the magnitude of these changes, the public saw none of it. The monarchy, as always, presented continuity, stability, control. But behind that carefully maintained image, a different reality was taking shape, one that required absolute confidentiality to sustain. Instructions were reinforced repeatedly, not through force, but through expectation. This was not a moment for interpretation, but for compliance. And so, the silence held. But silence, no matter how controlled, has its limits. Because while those within the palace adjusted, the outside world began to sense the shift. Subtle inconsistencies, unanswered questions, a change in tone that could not be fully disguised. Media outlets, always alert to even the slightest deviation, began to speculate, their inquiries growing sharper, more persistent. Without confirmation, without access, they pieced together fragments, constructing narratives that hovered just close enough to the truth to create pressure. And that pressure, though external, began to echo internally. Because the monarchy's greatest strength is its ability to control its narrative was now being tested by a situation that could not be easily explained or publicly addressed. Senior royals, each with their own roles to uphold, found themselves adapting to a structure that no longer functioned as it once had. Authority was no longer simply exercised, it was negotiated, balanced against conditions that had been set into motion beyond immediate control. And within that delicate balance, a strategy emerged not to reveal, not to deny, but contain. The narrative would remain tightly managed. The silence would continue. The image of stability would be preserved at all costs. But beneath that surface, the transformation was undeniable. The monarchy was no longer operating as it had before. It was evolving under pressure, reshaping itself in response to forces that could not be ignored or undone. And as that transformation deepened, one reality became increasingly difficult to contain, no matter how carefully the silence was maintained. But while the palace remained silent, the outside world was beginning to notice and ask questions that couldn't be ignored. It started with whispers in the press, subtle at first, then impossible to contain. What had been hidden behind palace doors was now slipping into public view, and the narrative was beginning to take shape. But the truth behind it was far more complex than anyone realized. What began as cautious speculation quickly evolved into a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Media outlets attuned to even the slightest deviation in royal routine began noting inconsistencies, unusual gaps in appearances, subtle shifts in positioning, and an unspoken tension that seemed to follow key figures without explanation. Analysts dissected every detail, every absence, every carefully chosen word, searching for meaning beneath the surface. And while no official confirmation was offered, the absence of denial only intensified the scrutiny. Because silence, in moments like these, does not calm speculation, it fuels it. At the center of that growing curiosity was Queen Camilla, whose presence, once steady and visible, now seemed noticeably restrained. It was not a disappearance, not an overt withdrawal, but a calculated reduction that raised more questions than it answered. Appearances became selective. Engagements shifted in tone. And those watching closely began to ask what had changed, and more importantly, why. Experts, long familiar with the monarchy's ability to manage perception, started to suggest that something deeper was unfolding, something internal, structured, and deliberate. Not a crisis in the traditional sense, but a reconfiguration of roles that had yet to be publicly acknowledged. And as those theories gained traction, they began to converge around a single idea: that the monarchy was undergoing a transformation not driven by external pressure, but by internal necessity. The narrative, though incomplete, beginning to solidify. Conversations once confined to private circles were now echoing across headlines, each interpretation adding another layer to a story that remained just out of reach. And through it all, the palace maintained its position: no confirmation, no denial, only a continuation of carefully controlled visibility that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. It was a strategy designed to contain, to delay, to manage the pace at which the truth emerged. But the truth, as it often does, was not static. It was evolving, expanding beyond the initial speculation into something far more significant. Because what the public was beginning to glimpse was not just a shift in visibility or influence, it was the consequence of a decision that had already been made, a process already in motion, one that could not be reversed simply by maintaining silence. And as attention intensified, the focus began to widen, moving beyond individual figures to the structure itself. Questions were no longer limited to who was affected. They began to address what this meant for the monarchy as a whole. Because if the changes being observed were as significant as they appeared, then their implications would not remain confined to the present moment. They would extend forward, shaping what came next in ways that few were prepared to fully understand. And just when it seemed the story had fully surfaced, a deeper implication began to emerge, one tied directly to the future of the monarchy. What began as a quiet discovery had now reshaped the monarchy's internal order. The enforcement of a single clause had triggered a shift that could define the institution for years to come. And as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore: this was never just about the past. It was about control of the future. What had once seemed like a contained legal mechanism had evolved into something far more influential, quietly redrawing the lines of hierarchy within the royal structure. Balance that had been maintained through tradition, perception, and carefully managed roles was no longer operating under the same assumptions. Instead, it was being guided by a renewed clarity, one that did not rely on interpretation, but on obligation. And at the center of that transformation stood William, Prince of Wales, whose decisive action had not only enforced the clause, but reinforced his position in a way that extended beyond his title as heir. This was no longer just about succession. In theory, it was about authority in practice. His role, once defined by preparation, had shifted into something more immediate, more active, as though the future had arrived ahead of schedule and demanded his leadership in the present. And with that shift came a deeper recognition of the enduring influence of Diana, Princess of Wales, whose legacy, far from fading into history, had reasserted itself with undeniable force. The clause, once hidden, had become a voice, one that carried forward her intentions, her priorities, and her vision for what the monarchy should protect moving forward. It was not a memory, it was a directive, and its impact was being felt across every level of the institution. At the same time, questions surrounding Queen Camilla had not disappeared, they had evolved. No longer framed by speculation alone, they now existed within a context shaped by structural change, where her role was being quietly redefined against a backdrop that no longer guaranteed the stability it once did. It was not a removal, not a public unraveling, but a recalibration that carried its own weight, its own consequences. And within that recalibration, the monarchy itself began to enter a new phase, one defined not by uncertainty, but by control. A controlled narrative, a controlled structure, a controlled future that was being shaped with deliberate precision. The institution, long known for its ability to adapt, was now doing so under circumstances that demanded more than quiet adjustment. It required a clear acknowledgement of where authority truly resided. Because what had unfolded was not just a reaction to a rediscovered clause, but a demonstration of how legacy and duty could converge to redefine power itself. And as those within the palace adjusted to this new reality, and those outside continued to observe and question, the transformation became undeniable. The monarchy was no longer what it had been before this moment. It had shifted, quietly but permanently, into a form that reflected both its past and its future in equal measure. Because in the end, this wasn't just a royal decision, it was a statement about who truly holds power when legacy and duty collide. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.